This is Dari on World Streams Radio. Professor Chomsky, in one of your recent articles, and I'll almost quote you because I don't have the text in front of me, you said you've never seen the levels of hate so high in the world as we see them now. It's everywhere, from the Swiss prohibiting minarets, the French banning veils, and recently at the New York Islamic Community Center rallies in the U.S. Where do you think this is coming from? What's stirring all this up?
Well, it's somewhat. I mean, you're right. It's all over the Western world, but it's somewhat different from country to country. In the case of Europe, I've always felt, frankly, that Europe is much more racist than the United States is. It didn't always show as much because the European societies tended to be pretty homogeneous. So in Denmark, almost everybody is blonde and blue-eyed, so they can rail about racism somewhere else. But there's been a change in recent years. There's been immigration into Europe for several reasons. One reason is that Europe needs poor, easily exploited workers like Turks or North Africans and others. So the business world and others want to bring them in. They need them. On the other hand, another factor is that it's a reflection of a long history of imperialism and destruction. I mean, there's a reason why the flow of immigrants is from North Africa, North and West Africa to France, and not the other way around. France brutally, viciously ruled those African regions, half destroyed them, and they're now a wreck, and people are trying to survive, so they come to the imperial country. Well, that has changed things, and it has led to a country after country, including England, a rise in right-wing parties, sometimes extreme, as in Austria, where the most extreme right-wing party, actually, really virtually neo-Nazi, has a chance to gain real political power.
Yes,
more
you have
happened in Hungary.
Yeah.
And
you have examples of those, Professor Chomsky, like Le Pen in France. You have what's his name, Geert Wilders, I think, in Netherlands.
Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. There's a similar party in England. In fact, virtually every country. Now, this is a reflection of the kinds of factors that I mentioned, based on long-standing European racism, which is very deep. Now, in the United States, it's similar but a little different. We should bear in mind that the United States had a long history of bitter antagonism towards immigrants, which has its ironies, since almost everybody here is an immigrant, except for the remnants of the indigenous population. But as each wave of immigrants kind of worked itself up, assimilated and so on, they became bitter and antagonistic to the next wave. That's been a regular process for 150 years, including, incidentally, the black immigration, the immigration of blacks from the South after mechanization of agriculture. Their move to the North was a kind of immigration, and it had similar effects. And now it's exacerbated, become much more extreme because of the economic crisis. And the economic crisis is not 2 years. We should remember that for over 30 years, for the majority of the population, real incomes have almost stagnated. Working hours have gone up very fast, far beyond Europe. Benefits, which were never very good by comparative standards, have declined. People have been getting by more working harder, more people in the workforce, more hours, and by increasing debt and by asset inflation, bubbles. But the bubbles burst, and you can only borrow so long. And that's happened now, and people are in real trouble. I mean, the housing bubble, which is largely traceable to the Federal Reserve and the economy, actually, the deregulation and so on, which goes back years. That's cost people roughly $8 trillion in savings for many people. Their life savings are gone. What they'd saved for retirement or for their children, that's gone. And people are in real trouble, not by third world standards, but by the standards of what you should expect in the richest country in the world. And that's led to a lot of bitterness, anger, hatred, opposition to institutions. Faith in institutions is abysmally low. Congress is despised. Corporations are hated. Banks are hated. Government's hated. The political parties, Republicans even more than the Democrats. It's just a kind of a generalized, unfocused anger. And a lot of it is turning against vulnerable people, partly because it's being directed that way. That's pretty common. It's kind of like in Nazi Germany when you focus the anger against the Jews, they're vulnerable. Here it's focused against immigrants and increasingly against teachers and public servants and so on, but primarily immigrants. And here there's a long story. Who are the immigrants? Well, the immigrants are coming mostly from Mexico and from Central America. In Central America, still are fleeing the destruction left by Reagan's terrorist wars, which devastated the region. In Mexico, it's substantially an effect of NAFTA. It was anticipated that NAFTA would have a very harsh effect on the Mexican labor market. They'd be undermined, kind of like what I said about Haiti. They would be undermined by highly subsidized U.S. Agricultural exports. Furthermore, the NAFTA agreement allowed U.S. enterprises to gain all the rights of Mexican enterprises. The Mexican individuals don't gain the rights of Americans, but corporations are specially privileged. And, of course, it'd be hard for them to compete against much larger and also largely subsidized U.S. corporations. Anyway, the effect has been to significantly undermine the Mexican economy as far as the workforce is concerned. The number of billionaires has increased, but not for the labor force. And in fact, this was anticipated. In 1994, when NAFTA was passed, actually rammed through Congress over the objections of the population, Clinton also began militarization of the border. The Mexican-U.S. border had been a pretty open border. Like most borders, it's the result of aggression. We, after all, are sitting on half of Mexico conquered in a war of aggression. But pretty much the same people lived on both sides of the borders. They'd cross the border to visit their relatives and so on. In 1994, Clinton began the militarization of the border. That's the year of the passage of NAFTA, and it's hard to believe that that's just coincidental. And since then, there's been ambivalence. The business world very much wants the immigrants. And in fact, a lot of the economy depends on them. They do very cheap, easily exploited labor. They do a lot of the dirty work in the society. So they're in the back rooms of the restaurants. They're mowing the lawns. They're doing a lot of construction work at very low wages. Since they're undocumented, they can be treated very harshly. And it gives a kind of an economic boost. At the same time, people here regard them as competitors. It's not realistic, in fact, but they regard them that way. And, hatred and fear typically are directed against someone, and typically it's the most vulnerable, so they're the targets. And that feeds racist and nativist sentiments that are very deep and keep coming out repeatedly. We might remember that if we go back, say, a little over a century, in Boston, where I live, the Irish immigrants were treated pretty much the same way. You could read signs in restaurants in Boston saying, "No dogs or Irish allowed," and the Irish were treated pretty much like the black population, which is about as low as you can get. Over time, they grew out of it. And you ended up with rich Irish families, and the Irish took over a large part of the bureaucracy and the political system and so on. So now they're integrated into the society, but certainly wasn't like that when they started coming in, especially after the Irish famine. And this is a typical phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. This is Saeed on World Streams Radio. If you've just joined us, we've been speaking with tonight's guest author, activist, linguist,